Recording. So if you're using these, you just need to press the. You have to press it while you're talking, unfortunately.
Okay. Good evening. I'll call to order this December 14th, 2022 special meeting, joint meeting of the Town Plan and Zoning Commission, the Fairfield Affordable Housing Committee. Start off by introducing ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
I'll start myself. I'm the chair of the Zoning Committee, Comm. Start here and go down this way.
Hi, his name is Tom Corsillo. Actually, this is my second meeting as part of the TPZ.
Nick Francis, TPZ. Alexis Harrison, TPZ.
Kathy Braun, zoning.
Jim West,
Brandman, TPZ, remotely.
Okay, yes, Lenny Brandman remotely on TPZ.
Yep. Hi, I'm Adam Texa, and I'm the POCD and zoning consultant for this project.
I am Steve Rothwell, and I'm the chair of the Affordable Housing Committee.
I'm Gretchen Gerger, and I'm secretary for Affordable Housing.
Earl Blindfolder, Affordable Housing Committee.
Joanne Zonka, Affordable Housing Committee.
Wayne Alperovich, Affordable Housing Committee.
Great. And it looks like Heather is also online, right?
I apologize, I had a hard time connecting.
No worries, you're all good. I'm just going to start with some brief introductory remarks, and then I'll turn it over to Adam, who's going to kind of lead us through a PowerPoint this evening. I just kind of want to recap a little bit of where we've been. We did, as many of you participated in, we had 3 successful public engagement workshops in January and February of 22, right before our COVID shutdown. We had tabletop discussions around conservation, economic development, and housing, and as well as infrastructure. And I just want to remind folks some of the key takeaways from that engagement were to look for opportunities to increase density downtown, balanced against infrastructure limitations of sewer and drainage. Design standards became important. How a development feels and looks and feels is more important than the number of units and the technical specs. So design standards were an important takeaway. There were mixed reviews regarding a potential air rights development at the downtown station parking lot. There was general consensus that a mixed-use residential commercial development would be appropriate for the former Exide property. And then a discussion about expanding residential opportunity downtown, but maintaining first-floor commercial is critical. Our consulting partners, FHI Studio, when they were made their initial presentation, as other consultants did, identified 3 big topic issues to tackle in this undertaking. One is issues around TOD, or transit-oriented development. 2 was targeting and maintaining commercial opportunities. And 3, examining housing issues. We have learned through our own TOD planning work in the past and now by experience that large-scale housing is in fact commercial economic development. We have 3 recent projects completed: Trademark at 665 Commerce Drive, Alto at 1410 Kings Highway, and Anchorage at 333 Uncle Road. Those 3 residential projects in Alto and Trademark being mixed use together paid $2.2 million in taxes, those 3 projects alone, which is more than GE paid. So those 3 projects are paying $2.2 million by themselves. So back in June, we met with our FHI partners to discuss consensus around overarching goals for our plan. You met jointly with the Flood and Erosion Control Board in July, outlining strategies around resiliency issues. We launched an online workshop to try to solidify and confirm some of the goals and strategies that we discussed and kind of re-engaged the community since our COVID hiatus. So tonight, we're here to talk about housing. As previously noted, issues around housing warrants further discussion based on the feedback that we've had thus far from the public. And as I'm sure you well know, the topic of housing is on the top of the news lately, locally and statewide, as it may relate to recent and ongoing development applications, as well as statewide discussions about the lack of housing opportunities beyond the traditional single-family dwelling and overall zoning reform. Our state statutes outline a responsibility for the POCD to provide the diversity of housing opportunities, including multifamily housing, as well as advancing the goals of the town's affordable housing plan. So we thought it beneficial, therefore, to include the Affordable Housing Committee in this discussion for their input. So Adam is going to briefly outline some of the big takeaways from that online workshop that are specific to our housing discussion, and then he'll outline some strategies and approaches for potential housing opportunities for your consideration and discussion tonight. The overall purpose being to identify some that we might want to include in the plan as we move forward. So we're hoping this is kind of an informal proceeding. We're hoping to have good discussion and dialogue. And with that, I will turn it over to Adam.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? All right, excellent. Is there a way we could maybe just turn off the front lights so this is a little bit easier to see?
I think the answer to that is yes.
Let's see if it kills. Yeah, that's perfect, right? Everybody can see still, but a little bit, we're not all squinting. So we can go to the next slide here. So just a quick review of the agenda today. I want to just kind of go through some of the previous work that we've done, give you a quick overview of some of the findings from the virtual workshop, which we had about 350 people participate in, but really focusing in on housing there, and then talk to you a little bit more about some potential housing strategies. But I want to be really clear about all of this, that we're looking for your input and thoughts on this. These are not final strategies. We're here to have a discussion around all of this. And so we're really looking for your input, and we're hoping through a sort of good discussion here that we're going to be able to iterate on this and sort of take it to the next level. So let's go to the next slide here. So just a reminder that we've looked at all of your previous planning work. One of the things that I want to emphasize is we did look at the affordable housing plan. We've, looked at the previous POCD, the TOD plan, basically all the work that you've done sort of coming up into this POCD effort. So if we go to the next slide. These are going to be really hard for, I think, people to read. That's okay. We had these summary goals that we had put together based on all those planning, all of those previous plans, and also the community engagement from the first round. That was something that we discussed in a meeting, and we made some revisions to those so that there's sort of a good foundation for the work that we've got going forward. So if we keep going to the next slide. We also— Are you going to give us this afterwards? I will give this. I will give this to you afterwards. So the other thing that we had a conversation about resiliency, and we proposed a resiliency framework to all of you. We got some feedback on that, and that's going to be incorporated into the POCD and has some sort of implications for the housing strategy that we'll get into today, and I'll highlight those. So if we go to the next slide, this is sort of the virtual workshop. Is this a little fuzzy for everybody? Yes, it's not just my eyes going bad in my relatively young old age. Do we have a remote for the, right now it won't be as critical, but as we get to the next couple of slides, I just want to make sure that people can see. Is there like a focus button on this?
Emily, can you zoom in? Does that help?
Apparently the focus function is not available.
That function is not available. Well, when we get into it, we can zoom in on this. And like I said, I will share this. But we asked people some questions about what they saw as the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities in Fairfield. And when they talked about the strengths, you know, the parks, the beaches, the open space, the people, the culture, the schools, and the housing and neighborhood quality all really sort of rose to the top as elements that really shine through for people as strengths in Fairfield. If we go to the next slide, when people were talking about the weaknesses, interestingly, we saw sort of housing and neighborhood quality and land use and zoning sort of up at the top. Housing affordability as being a major issue, people and culture, and transportation and mobility. And one of the nice things about the virtual workshop that we did is we not only asked people to rank things, but as many of you know, since you participated in it, you were able to give sort of long answers or longer answers about what that is. And one of the things that we heard through all of this is that those first 4 things, housing and neighborhood quality, land use and zoning, housing and affordability, and people and culture, are all really interrelated topics. And the idea is that, you know, Fairfield is changing. It's growing. There's an increased demand for housing in Fairfield, which is impacting housing affordability. And there's some feeling that the land use and zoning isn't working in the right way to sort of support the housing that people want, especially some concern about degradation of housing sort of and neighborhood quality, but also not providing enough affordable housing. And a key part of this was that this issue was really driving a lot of sort of tension, especially on social media, amongst, you know, residents and neighbors. There was a sense of, hey, we're fighting about some of this stuff, and that was taking away from the people and culture. So that's why those things can both be strengths and weaknesses at the same time, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Can you say a word about number 1, housing and neighborhood quality? Because that, I would never have expected that Fairfield. I think we have good housing and good neighborhoods.
Right, and so that's what it gets back to sort of, it's not that the housing and the neighborhood quality itself is bad, it's that people selected that option and then their concern was that it was under threat. I think is a better way to think about this, is that those neighborhoods, people have, there's a lot of anxiety out there that changes in the housing market are affecting neighborhood quality, if that makes sense.
I have a question, Adam,
Yeah.
and I don't know how scientific the survey that we did, or what, did you track like what ages, demographics?
We do have that data. We haven't like dug into that in a lot of detail. Are you sort of, what is your question around that?
I guess I'm just curious what age groups do certain topics, you know, what's most important? Is it house, is it affordability, is it neighborhoods, what is it? And then I'm just curious, I'm not talking to my microphone. Have we taken into account our proximity to New York City and how that might impact the cost of housing? Because that's a big issue, because as you know, Fairfield is more expensive, rented is more expensive than Winstead, Connecticut, because of those proximities to New York City and jobs.
Yeah, so that's a really good, we can dig into that a little bit more. So
That's important.
Yep, we're doing sort of multiple passes on the workshop, and so questions like that are really helpful. Sort of we can look into some of the demographics and what they cared about based on different demographics.
Just a quick question, Ms. Harrigan, are you picking up people that don't get on their microphone?
I would strongly suggest you use the microphone.
Okay.
Got it, sorry.
Because it'll be so much clearer. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll just reiterate, the question was about, if I get this correctly, that what did different demographics care about? Basically, what were their issues and what were their strengths? Is that sort of?
Yeah, that's correct. And I also, you kind of alluded to the fact that maybe zoning isn't working, and I would love to learn more about that too. What isn't working, what is working.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big term for survey.
Yeah, I think, I suspect, and I haven't seen the data, but I think some of that may be reflective of the general anxiety or concern relative to 8-30G applications and the fact that those types of applications aren't necessarily within our zoning scheme. So that shows up, as Adam said, both as a strength and a weakness, as people, we do hear a lot from certain folks like downsizing seniors, for example, say, hey, I'd love to sell my house, but there's lack of opportunity of where I might want to go to, versus folks that feel threatened, or their neighborhood might feel threatened of this, the looming 8-30G presence.
Yeah, I would agree with that, when we're talking about land use and zoning, so if you remember sort of how all of the survey worked, people sort of picked broad topics and then elaborated on them. And I would agree that the land use and zoning really is around some of the 830-G and also the housing and neighborhood quality issues. That's why I would say those sort of top 4 issues were all interrelated, and you could almost collapse those into a single category that would just sort of rise very much to the top. And then if we go to opportunities, not a surprise that sort of housing and neighborhood quality, land use and zoning really rises to the top. But I think one of the interesting things here is the sort of transportation and mobility. In the previous slide and in this slide, is sort of the second big issue that people seem to really care about. And then it looks like there's some real opportunities to address sort of parks and open spaces, less in that they are not working well, but there are more opportunities to make them even better. And then housing affordability, which is one of the big topics that we're going to get into today, is right up there. So this is just sort of a top level summary of some of the kind of housing issues that we've got, but there's a lot more information that we'll be talking about as this process continues from the survey results. So this kind of goes back to this core issue that I think we've been hearing a lot from the previous engagement work, but also really came through on this workshop, which is it's a very circular argument where people do want diversity and affordability in the community. That then raises questions about character preservation, which we're sort of broadly calling sort of neighborhood quality, housing quality, which then raises these questions of diversity and affordability. And I would suspect if you all, if I polled you right now, you have all been involved in this very circular argument at some point in time while on your commission piece. It's, hey, we want more diversity and affordability, that would be great. Oh, wait, but we are worried about it impacting the character of our neighborhoods. It's going to be big. We don't want any of this 8-30G stuff. Oh, this is going to be an impact, but we still want diversity and affordability, and the conversation spins around and spins around and spins around. Would that be a sort of fair assessment of what you all have heard as part of this process? Yes, please. Yes.
Just, okay. I do see all of those things, but I never saw them as mutually exclusive or unable to do both. I don't see the circularity of it. I think you can add a diversity while maintaining character. You need standards and design standards. The problem with 8-30G is it eviscerates all zoning together, more or less. You basically eliminate all the benefits of zoning for any 8-30G project, and you put the burden on the commission. So it's almost an impossible situation. That's a separate category to me than all those other pros and cons on both sides. 8-30G is different because it basically takes you outside of zoning and eliminates zoning almost completely. So I don't see it as mutually exclusive.
I think you're right, and I think that that's going to be a big part of this POCD effort that we're going to be working on, and it's certainly something that was sort of started in the affordable housing plan, is trying to educate a little bit more that these two things aren't mutually exclusive, and talk about, we don't have a lot of control over the 8-30G stuff, but we can talk about affordability and diversity of housing options and the preservation of character as a unified effort going forward. And that's, in fact, a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. So that's a great point. And I will just say, if you thought you were unique in this regard, you're not. This is something that communities all across the country, quite frankly, are dealing with right now. It is a big, big problem nationally. It's a big problem in the Northeast region especially, and you mentioned earlier the sort of greater New York City geography. When you have really high cost of living areas like New York City, it's going to consistently push out into the sort of larger region. And so you're not unique, and a lot of the strategies that we're going to sort of talk about today, I think, are things that other communities are trying and working with to try to sort of thread this needle a little bit. Yeah.
When 8-30G first was implemented, I was in politics back then, it was truly affordable.
Yep.
Okay? And this is the problem that people are having now. These places are not affordable to the people who are in need of affordability. These are, the pricing is outrageous. Fairfield has, our median income is $140,000. Okay, so you break that down to 80%. Where does that leave you?
Yeah.
How many people at that rate need affordability?
Yeah.
You're talking people at 60,000 and under are the ones that need these places. So when are we going to start looking at the fact that we need to actually make these affordable? That's the conversations I have daily.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful to hear. And what I'm hearing from you, just so it's clear here, is that because of the way that the law is structured, it's done based on area median income. And because Fairfield's area median income is so high, it's not really getting at what would be sort of generally considered low-income households. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. And my biggest concern is the fact that we have these, I call them prison-like buildings. They do not give opportunity for children to live and grow. There's nowhere that they can go play. There's no place that they can have friends. The seniors can't downsize, okay? The people that work in the town have to move out of the town in order to be able to afford a home. I mean, I grew up in affordable housing that was built for town employees, police, fire, returning soldiers in Westport. So we were one of the first families there. That's what I consider affordable housing.
Yeah.
And that's what most people consider affordable housing. And they love when I do this, but my biggest pet peeve is we're not doing pocket housing, which allows people to live together, grow together, and allows children to actually have an upbringing of many different people and diversity in the neighborhood.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm interested in that and exploring a little bit. So what I'd like to do is kind of dig into this a little bit more, and then we can kind of come back around to that, okay? You know, with housing, one of the things that I do want to sort of emphasize is there is a lot of common ground, around this, and this is a little bit what we're talking about is a focus on neighborhood and architectural quality, a little bit of what you were just talking about, a focus on sense of community and small town feel, something that's grounded in history and tradition, walkable, affordable, diversity in housing typologies, and then connection sort of maybe should have been at the bottom, but all of this connected to sort of parks and beaches and a network of open spaces and green spaces. So I think that is where there's a lot of common ground, and I really like this quote that was somebody from the workshop, that just says, we have an opportunity to engage more members of the community to come up with creative solutions to the challenge. And it is a challenge. It is going to be something that you're going to have to continue to work on, but I think we can start to sort of move the ball forward here on some creative solutions. And that's what we're going to get into a little bit here today. So when it comes to housing, we've sort of come up with some top-level strategies that we want to focus on. The first is sort of maintaining historic districts and legacy neighborhoods. I think it's going to be very important as you continue to roll out your housing strategy. You know, when we saw those, what were the weaknesses, basically what are the fears that people have, a big fear that a lot of people are going to have is that their neighborhood is really going to change. that housing policy is going to come out, and all of a sudden this neighborhood that they bought into, that they invested in, is going to change really heavily. And I think it's going to be really important to communicate that that's not what's going to happen in large parts of Fairfield, that there's going to be a lot of maintaining of the existing housing stock in a lot of the existing neighborhoods. But at the same time, there's going to be a need to diversify housing options in strategic locations. As much as I wish I had the great magic wand, I don't have the great magic wand that's going to solve the 8-30G issue, but there are things that you can do to diversify housing options outside of that, and we're going to get to talking about a lot of this. And then a big thing is going to be promoting housing near transit facilities. And I know this is something that you all have dug into in a lot previously, and we've looked at the TOD plan, so we're going to get into that, but I don't want to get into that in too much detail because I think that sort of middle bullet point is where there's a lot of meat for us to have a conversation. So let's talk about what that actually looks like. So if we go to the next slide. This is sort of the maintain area. And one of the things that I want to sort of emphasize is this is our zoning map. So we're talking about some of the kind of core areas that are going to maintain their relative stability over time. If this looks like a map that basically is just all of Fairfield, that's because from a geographic point of view, from sort of a land perspective, it is. There's large portions of the community which are built out, which are relatively stable communities, and which there's not a lot of opportunity to make big housing changes there. There are, however, opportunities to diversify some housing options. And so we're going to go to the next slide about where that is. So the first one is, can we go back just before? No, it's all right. It's just to expand and improve the center design business district. And I know this is something that's been talked about a little bit, but I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about what that would actually look like. So if we scroll down. So if we extend the CDD district west, this would be consistent with the TOD plan, which is out there, and would create a lot more support for multifamily residential, and would really extend the sort of walkable standards that are required in the CDD district all the way to that big sort of vacant Exxon property that's on the west there. So if we go to the next slide here, another big thing about this is going to be changing this 50-50 design standard, basically, that requires 50% of the floor area to be commercial in any of these mixed-use developments. And what I'm going to walk you through, basically, is why you haven't seen a lot of development, a lot of mixed-use development in your downtown district. And I think it's because of this standard. So some things to really keep in mind as we do this. So a typical upper floor sort of residential building is 70 feet deep. And what that means is that one of your units is usually about 30 feet. You have about a 10-foot wide hallway, and then another 30 feet for another unit that faces to the back. And that's sort of a general standard to think about. Some go a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, but after about a 30-foot sort of deep unit, you just can't get light all the way back there, so nobody builds it because nobody wants to rent it. The other thing that's really important to know is in sort of like modern retail development, you really don't go further back than 50 feet from your front door, the sort of front display windows. Unless you're doing a very different type of project, something like a supermarket or a Target are huge, right? Those are 150, 250 feet deep, but they're all completely dark on the inside and everybody's living off of overhead lights. It's not the sort of typical retail space that you're trying to encourage in the CDD district. The other thing is that second floor commercial space is always going to be very, very difficult to rent. So that's the space, any sort of commercial space that's not on the sidewalk, that doesn't have a direct access to the sidewalk, is going to be really hard to rent unless you are in an office building where everything above the second floor is office space. And then another big piece of this is that when you have multiple uses in the same building, like an office, a retail tenant, and a residential unit, it's going to be very, very difficult to finance and build, because what a lot of this, just to sort of take a step back on this, what a lot of banks are going to ask you to do when you're financing a building is you've got to prove that you can lease each piece of the building, and you're going to get revenue from that. And the more you stack in, so, hey, we're going to have to lease office space, and we're going to have to lease this to retail tenants, and we're going to have to lease this to residential tenants, it becomes harder and harder to meet that threshold. And quite frankly, there are very few builders out there, there are very few developers who would work in that kind of space anyways, because it's so complicated. When you're talking about mixed use, and this took a long time for the industry, quite frankly, to catch up to, it's only within the last 10 years that you've seen residential and retail mixed use really become something that can easily be financed within the market. And then the last thing is that for a while now and into the relatively foreseeable future, residential is going to be driving the market on your development. So there are a lot of developers who will basically pencil out their development, make sure that it works financially in a mixed-use development without counting in any of the retail leasing, because the residential is such an important driver of everything, and the retail side of it can be so uncertain. They can go for a year or 2 years without leasing out the retail space. So before we go further, any questions on that? Because I just threw a lot of sort of facts at you.
Question.
Yeah.
For retail in the general, does that include restaurants, or is that generally just, okay?
Yeah, that includes restaurant. That's what when I talk about retail here, and that's helpful, I'm thinking mostly about what I call sort of Main Street commercial spaces. So restaurants, bars, anything up to about like a CVS in terms of kind of the size of retail that you're talking about. That's about the biggest that you'd probably be thinking about in this.
Could you clarify what you said? You said something about in recent years, financing has opened up for retail and residential, or I didn't hear what you said exactly.
Yeah, so a quick historical detour. For a long time, the financing people really were focused, and this was because of what the demand was really focused on product types. So you would go to your financing people who finance residential stuff, and they would do an analysis of your development, and they'd say, okay, we'll give you money to build the residential stuff. And then, or you go to your retail financer, and they'd have their sort of pencil out analysis. When mixed-use development started to become sort of a more of a thing, which was about 10, 15 years ago, it took that industry a long time to kind of catch up. And now we're at a point where mixed-use development is common enough that they are able to finance it, they're able to do their sort of due diligence to be able to finance that. But when you start adding in office and other types of things, it becomes a lot more complicated. So you will see that in really high-end markets. If you go into New York City, you'll see really, but it's because the money and the profit is such a different level that it's worth them to go through that entire process. But in a place like Fairfield, the market doesn't make any sense to go into that level of detail. Cool. So let's go to the next slide. And this is going to be a little explanation of why your 50-50 standard, to remember, isn't really working. And part of that is because if we remember that, what a lot of developers are going to be looking to do is maximize the amount of residential units that they can get. And in order to do that with your sort of current standards, which is a max height of 5 stories or 50 feet and an FAR of 2, they would have to build 2 stories of commercial in order to get 2 stories of residential, because you have this 50-50 requirements. And those are sort of 2 prototypes of 2 different types of development that you get on that. You get a building with a retail space on the ground floor, a likely office space on the second floor, and then 2 stories of residential on top of it. That's how you would do it as sort of normal 70-foot deep building. Or you would have to build a really deep commercial building, so something like 140 feet deep, in order to get the square footage that you would need to do 2 stories of residential on top. And so the problem with that is in that sort of top diagram, the office is very, very difficult to rent. You also have 3 different types of uses, which is going to be very difficult to finance. And in that bottom diagram, when you're talking about a building that's like 140 feet deep, you're really getting into like the supermarket size building. You're really getting into a retail tenant that would be like a Target, a Home Depot, something that big, and nobody wants to live above a Home Depot. You know, as much as they probably would, you know, Home Depot would love that, but nobody's living above them. Some people may want to live above a Target, but it's not the kind of use that you're looking to encourage in your CDD sort of area. So if we go to the next slide. The other problem that you run into here is because that retail depth is really only about 50 feet, the sort of valuable retail depth is only about 50 feet, most developments that kind of do mixed use, what they do is they end up putting parking in that last 20 feet. It's sort of parked underneath the building in the back. And the problem is if you were wanting to do that in your district right now, then you'd have to shave back some of your residential units in order to even make this possible. So it becomes a really difficult product for a developer to even think about bringing to market if they even wanted to develop in the district. So if we go forward one more. So what you're functionally permitting right now is essentially this building, which is 1 level of commercial and 1 level of residential. So your 50-foot max height doesn't even really matter, because this is the only thing that anybody would reasonably develop in your district. The problem with this is nobody is building this at a mixed use level because it's too complicated to finance for a project this size. But then also, if you think about it, you're going to have to find somebody who's going to lease and be skilled at leasing both retail space and residential space. Then on top of that, you're going to have to think about the fact that you're not going to get that many residential units out of something like this. And so having a leasing agent there who's going to be able to manage that just doesn't make a lot of sense. So when you do see these buildings, and you'll see lots of them out there, they're mostly historic buildings. They're mostly buildings that were built in a different era when financing was different, when a lot of people were basically financing and building their own properties. And a lot of the rental space, the residential space above that is like, they call them a lot of the old school, like live work. Like you own the shop below and you live above it. Over time, some of these were consolidated and they're renting the unit above that, but it's not a professional renting service. It's somebody who's a single property owner. Maybe they own a couple of these and they're renting them maybe on like Craigslist or something like that. It's not a professional developer coming in and building that. The other problem with these kinds of buildings is there's never an elevator in them because it doesn't make sense from an economic standpoint, so they're not ADA accessible. And because they're so small and you're trying to maximize your sort of rents, you're not doing affordable housing in something like this. So that, I think, is one of the big reasons why you're having a hard time in this district seeing any interest, despite the fact that Fairfield's a very attractive place to live, and I think a lot of people want to be living here. And there would be some opportunity if the regulations were right. So if we go to the next slide, the recommendation here would be to change the CDD district standards to eliminate that 50% rule. Just get rid of it, but require the ground floor commercial along the street. So we're talking about a minimum of 15 feet high commercial space. So this is really high quality commercial space. It's going to add to your grand list, so you're going to get taxes out of this. We've talked to a lot to the Economic Development Committee and their concerns about loss of commercial space and the importance of that. So you're still getting that commercial space out of it. That you would permit ground floor residential after the first 50 feet of commercial space. So if you have a 200-foot deep lot, once you build sort of commercial space on the street side of it, whatever happens behind that could be residential, and I'll explain a little bit in the next slide why that's important. It would be important to set the max height at 4 stories or 52 feet. So this is really 1 floor of commercial and then 3 floors of residential above that. To make all that work, we want to increase FAR to 3, and then this is a conversation that I think is going to be really important about all of this, really starting to establish some strong form and design standards, because as you can see in those 4 pictures there, those are all essentially the same product. From a developer's perspective, from a developer's perspective, from a financing perspective, those are all relatively built the same way. They just have different finishes and different styles applied to them. So if you don't have good design standards and good form standards as part of all of this, you could get any one of those 4 products, depending on the sort of mood of the applicant at that time. So I'll stop here because there's some questions.
Yeah, sorry,
sorry to interrupt your train of thought there. And parking is always a big issue, especially in downtown, so, and you didn't really address that, so where would we be parking in a building like this? Would it be underground?
Yeah, so there's a couple of options. At a building this size, underground parking is possible, but pretty unlikely. Okay, because when you have to go down that far, it gets really, really expensive really quickly. So one of the diagrams that I showed previously is that you have at least 1 row of parking that's actually underneath the building. And then most likely what you would end up having is surface parking in the back of the building. Depending on the size of the lot and the configuration of the lot, a lot of developers, and this goes back to sort of form and design standards, are going to try to wrap that. You'll see a lot of U-shaped buildings where the building sort of wraps around the parking lot that's in the middle of the building. So from the street, it becomes difficult to see the parking. And that's something that, again, going back to your form and design standards, you can start requiring that kind of development so that, you know, on your primary, especially your primary streets, parking is actually tucked back behind the building. Yeah.
And just so that I'm clear on this, this entire discussion has to do with only a portion of the post road?
Yes. Presently, the Center Design District geographically is essentially from Beach Road west to just a hair west of Mill Plain Road. One of the considerations we've been talking about is pushing that boundary westerly, perhaps to the Mill River, to encapsulate, you know, the Exide site, to try to create an opportunity there, because the consensus feedback at our prior engagement, there was general support that ought to be a mixed-use building. You know, if there were a real good office market, which there's not, there might be a different thought there, but since I think in the foreseeable future, as Adam pointed out, you know, residential is kind of driving the marketplace, looking to move that boundary line westerly. So yes, this is a limited geography implication.
Yes, and that's it. This is just one of the strategies, and I want to be clear. We're going to talk about some other locations and some other strategies to focus on here. I think the other thing about this kind of residential that's really going to be important to remember is this will bring people into the district as the development sort of progresses, which is going to be a really big support for your retail and your commercial spaces down there. This is an opportunity to really sort of reinforce the area as a transit district, as a TOD area that a lot of people are talking about. So when it comes to parking, that's something that certainly, you know, needs to be explored, is sort of what are the right parking ratios for this, so that, you know, you can limit the amount of impact that parking is going to have in the overall quality of the project. All right, let's keep going. So this is the Exide property, and what I just wanted to sort of explain to you, give you a little bit of an explanation here, is this is why I was talking about you know, requiring ground floor commercial only for that first sort of 50 feet, because there's about another 150 to 200 feet back there of space that's not going to be really great for commercial development, and that could hold a lot of, you know, residential development, and you wouldn't want to force somebody to have commercial development in that sort of back area when they could be adding a lot more residential units there. So you could see in the back there where it says ground floor commercial optional, a 4-story residential only building that's part of a larger development program for the entire site. I think the key thing would be is you couldn't do anything in that ground floor commercial optional area until you had already done something on that ground floor commercial required area. You'd have to have the front in order for the back to be approved. And any questions on this? Yeah.
You know, this is Heather. I'm on the line. I'm sorry. So here's my question regarding this Exide property. And I should state that I grew up on Fairfield Place, which is so I remember the factory actually when it was opened. And my father was very instrumental in the cleanup in Mill River, as well as having the property demolished. But here's a question for you. I was told that the reason it has not been developed to date was because the owners, which is now an LLC, will only provide a 99-year lease, and that they don't want to sell the property. And I don't know if that's folklore or if that's true. And I'm just curious if anyone actually knows that answer, because this property has been mentioned several times and with understanding of why, and yet nothing ever seems to happen. And that's, I was told the reason why is because of a 99-year lease versus, you know, selling the property to a corporation.
No, I don't know that there's that's really reality. I think it's more likely that the current owners, it's probably true that they want to maintain ownership, but that wouldn't foreclose a long-term ground lease and for another development entity to do a development. That's not an uncommon phenomenon or something that would be, you know, a detriment to ultimately developing it. What we're trying to do is create you know, what's the right mix of uses and design that might be palatable, so we can give a prospective investor a little bit more certainty on what they might be faced if they come in with such a plan. So I think part of the issue is we don't have a defined scheme. There's a little bit of ambiguity about what the current zoning is on that property, and we're trying to create a little bit more guidance to help guide that potential investment opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate, I mean, the zoning for this site right now is not supportive of the redevelopment of the site as it sits right now. You would basically, you know, it's in a different district, but all of the same rules basically that just went over apply. And so you're asking somebody to put as much commercial property here as development as they're putting residential development here, and that is and it's got to be mixed use. I can't think of, quite frankly, a market where you know, rents are high enough that would justify that kind of development right now. Here and then there.
I mean, I think there is a lot of opportunity at this Exide property. Kathy Braun here and I, we were part of your plan, and we were part of the cleanup, so we have probably a special, connection to this property. But I would say, you know, part of what residents do want is open space. They want to be able to enjoy the outdoors. It abuts the Mill River, one of our greatest natural resources in Fairfield. And I think that should be considered when we do mixed use. I mean, I have a vision where we have an opportunity where people can go kayaking, you know, right in this river, you know, be able to drive up there. So I think that we also need to take into account, you know, using our natural resources and giving the people access to them.
We agree with that wholeheartedly, and that's been communicated in any even preliminary discussion. The current owners are aware of that, and any prospective investor that we've even had preliminary conversations with have been told that, you know, we need to activate that waterfront and create a public access opportunity.
Yeah, I'm gonna, a quick follow-up to that, and then we'll hear, and then over there. So you said access to the waterfront there. What would be the trade-off that you are willing to make from a development perspective for that to happen? I mean, there is going to be a question around all of this, which is, you know, we live in a capitalist society. Somebody owns a property. If you want them to do something, there's going to be a give and take. I mean, would providing another story of development as part of this, like letting them go to 5 stories along this site, be something worth entertaining as part of that?
Well, there are actually conditions already associated with that property.
Okay.
They're supposed to restore all the wetlands, which has not been done, et cetera, et cetera. There's also a 144-foot setback if that's an inland wetland versus the tidal wetland. I'm not sure at that point. But there are restrictions already in place.
Got it.
Whether conditions or by regulation.
Good.
So I would say right where your line is, that should be natural to the river, and the rest of it can be developed. But I did have a question. I don't think your outline is intended to be one supermassive structure. I would expect there to be some green space in there as well. And, you know, not just that's about a 6-acre site altogether. So I would not expect to have like a 4 or 5 acre building, you know?
Right. I think that's accurate. What I would say is right now, your regulations don't do a very good job of requiring like a breaking up of that frontage, and that would be something worth exploring a little bit more. And that's when it gets into a little bit more like the design standards. I think what we're trying to get to here a little bit is like the fundamentals, and then we'll get into a little bit more the design. But yes, I think it would be surprising to see a building that would go that continuous length. Unfortunately, I have seen some very strange development proposals in my life, and so it's always good to sort of think ahead a little bit about what the options are.
I have a question about parking. Why wouldn't you allow parking in the back half? Instead of residential, where else would you put the parking? I don't even know if you could dig down.
Yeah, any scenario on this site, and again, this is just kind of an example of just use mix more than anything else, but it's likely that beyond that street front commercial presence, there's going to be surface or even structured parking behind that, so as...
Under the building, in the building, or...
Correct, you know, at grade, and then perhaps structured parking that the commercial use in the upper floor residential uses wrap around.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's going to be, for a substantial number of uses or units or square footage, you're going to need parking. So a lot of that is going to be parking footprint that's going to be wrapped by structure. But again, we don't need to get into the specific design here, but just the concept of the potential changes in the use scheme, and then, and as we talked, that, you know, obviously form and design guidelines are going to play an important role.
Yeah. And just a PS
Sorry, you had a...
Sorry, thanks, Joy.
And just a PS to my comment, to me, this would be an ideal place for affordable housing. It is on Route 1, it's near highways, it's near stores. You know, some of these 830G proposals we get are in the middle of neighborhoods where you can't access the highway or a bus line, and it almost seems preposterous. So I think this would be a great place. This is the gateway to Fairfield, and I think affordable housing would be very appropriate here.
Thank you. You waited long enough, thank you.
Thanks, Joanne.
I'm very patient. No. Okay, so my whole committee knows I talk about this property multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
I came to live in Fairfield, well, I lived here 50 years ago, but I also came back in 2014, and my first thought, I've always been an advocate of affordable housing, okay? My first thought was that would be the ideal place for affordable housing, but not as you're putting it forth.
Mm-hmm.
Those big buildings, again, to me, don't help anybody. Now, the building itself, that's not part of the development, correct?
What building are we talking about?
Their office buildings?
The one on the right there?
Right.
Correct, yes.
Okay, so why could we not do what I am an advocate for, pocket housing? Which would be, I don't know if any of you know any of the developments around in Westport and stuff like that. They're mostly duplexes, with great yards, you know, green yards and places for kids to grow up and have friends and seniors to live there, veterans, that's our biggest thing. We have too many homeless veterans we need to start housing. So why would we not be able to make that into a pocket housing development?
So it's a really good question. There's a couple of things that I want to say. I don't want to get too hung up on just this area, because we are going to talk about some of those issues in other areas. One thing that we've heard from the Economic Development Committee, and we've heard from other people, is that Fairfield has this really sort of like difficult situation, which is there's not a lot of commercial land that's zoned for commercial property, and that commercial property is a really important contributor to your tax base. And so there's been a very strong concern that anything that goes forward in terms of sort of core commercial areas really need to incorporate commercial space so that there's contributions to your tax base. The problem is once you have that piece, it sort of necessitates a certain development type that is different from that pocket. It's also, I would say, the corridor itself is not an ideal location for the type of housing that you're really talking about because of the volume of traffic that's going there. We'll talk about some other spaces where I think that type of housing is more appropriate, and we can kind of get into it. But this is a major sort of commercial corridor that's going to be, that if we can't zoom out here in a lot of ways, that carries a lot of traffic, and that where the condition is less what people might call neighborhood focus and more sort of downtown commercial focus. And I think that's going to be something to think about as you go forward. So why don't we keep going, because I think we're going to get into the topics that you've brought up. Yep.
I just want to go back to a question you asked either Kathy or Alexis about, if the developer gave access to the Mill River,
yep,
what might the town give to the developer? What yep, density or height of something? And I was involved with a development where the developer deeded 150 feet along the Mill River, similar to that, deeded that to the town for a boardwalk and a fishing pier. Mm-hmm. And in exchange for that, they got a bit more density and the building height. And I think that those are the kinds of creative thought process we should have as we look at the developments throughout the town. Yeah,
thank you very much. That's very helpful. So let's keep moving along here. So upzone strategically. This is going to be a really important part of this, because this is where we're talking about really sort of strategic infill development that's going to be a lot more about sort of this sort of what you call kind of pocket housing that we're talking about previously. So let's go here. So one area to sort of focus on, and what I want to do is sort of talk about the areas, talk about the upzoning, and then we'll get into the details. Is this sort of a relatively small A district that is right behind sort of your downtown design district, that is sort of a good opportunity to sort of look at, hey, what if a little bit more dense housing were made an opportunity in this area. So that would be changing from an A zone to a C zone. Let's keep going to the next one. Another one are these two neighborhoods that are out on Post Road and Kings Highway. These would be moving from a B to a C. So we're getting a little bit closer to the train station out that way.
B is, I'm sorry, the red?
Sorry, to be clear, it's a little hard to tell here, but they're outlined in black. Yeah, there, and then there's one, yeah, right there. So those would be two zones to go from B to C. But then also we're talking about, if we keep going to the next slide here, a modification to that C zone standards that we think would allow for more of this, what you kind of call pocket housing, sometimes called missing middle housing, some opportunity to inject some different housing typologies into the zoning code. So if we go to the next one. So if we go up, so one thing that we're thinking about is reducing the minimum lot size in the C zone for 4-family housing units. So you already permit 4-family units, but right now you require 12,500 square foot lots. We think if you drop that down, oh, I'm missing a 0 there, so it should be 10,000. I'm not suggesting a 1,000-foot lot. A 10,000 square foot lot, what you'd be able to do would be to permit what is called, often called here, a stacked twin townhome. Okay, so what it is it's 4 units. There are 2 units on the bottom and there are 2 units up top. They can be accessed from like one door, but what you have in the back is a garage. So every unit gets its own covered garage, and then every unit gets its own surface parking garage. That's usually how these go. There's one access point, so there's one driveway, and from the outside, a lot of times you can get these to look a lot like a large, essentially what looks like a large single-family home. And the nice thing about these kinds of developments is you can get 4 1,000 square foot units, okay? So that's enough to do a 2-bedroom, maybe a large 1-bedroom, smaller 2-bedroom. It depends a little bit on, this is sort of a typical, you can get a little bit bigger if you have a bigger lot, but this would be sort of the smallest that you would end up going on this. And I did this sort of typology here using all of the setbacks from the C zone. So you would meet all your front yard setback requirements, all your side yard requirements in order to do this. So if we go to the next slide, these exist all across the country. They're very common in a lot of more traditional neighborhoods. But these can look a little big, but it's basically this configuration where you have the units on the bottom, you have the units on the top. On the picture on the left, it looks a little bit more like a twin, where you're accessing in from the left and right side. The 2 on the right, you're actually accessing from the middle. But if you were to drive by these homes, you might mistake them for twins or for even large single-family homes. So if we go to the next slide. So a big part of all of this is going to be regulating character and form. Why don't we actually go back to the other slide? And I want to see if anybody has any questions about sort of this set of recommendations.
Are they all the same size, or are some of them 2 stories and some of them 1 story? They're all the same 1-story flats, more or less.
Yeah, so usually what they are, they're 1-story. It's a 1-story flat. It's about 4,000 square feet for the entire building, and each unit has about 1,000 square feet.
I did have one question.
Yeah.
Currently, a number of our B properties, or Zone B properties,
Can you put on your mic, please?
I thought it was on.
Oh,
Sorry about that. So currently we have a number of Zone B properties, duplex properties, 2-family properties, below the 9,000 square foot minimum that are in place, so non-conforming. Quite a few, hundreds actually of them. and they seem to be working very well. They seem to fit in very well within those neighborhoods. So I think the question is could we in fact look at a possible change in definition for Zone B, at least in certain areas? So taking an early look at some single-family properties below 9,000 square feet currently that are not duplex two-family. And a number of those seem like they would be equally attractive if we decided to go in that direction. So just a thought while we're talking about these A, B, and C possible rezonings for consideration.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the kind of feedback that we're looking for along this. I think that that's, the recommendation that I would make with a lot of this is to move incrementally through this, work on a couple of zones, see how it's working, take another step into some more zones. And as part of the POCD, we can sort of lay the framework for this. But I've been working in another community in Pennsylvania, and they really decided, they sort of redid their whole zoning ordinance, and then they stepped back for a second and they're like, oh my God, this is going to be a big change. Why don't we try this a little bit here? But I think those kinds of small changes in the sort of looking at duplexes at 9,000 square feet in the B zone is like a good incremental step in moving things forward, and see what happens, and see what kind of applications you get.
And just a corollary comment. In looking at the A's, because the A's have a minimum 9,375 square foot of criterion, there's quite a diversity in size in terms of Zone A properties. I mean, they range from a couple thousand square feet all the way up to well beyond an acre. Mm-hmm. And in fact, about a quarter of our existing Zone A properties are, in fact, would be considered non-conforming. So they're less than 9,375 square feet. So I realize that this might be more difficult because some of these would be considered more traditional, single-family, neighborhoods. Yep. So we'd have to be careful in terms of any kind of change we would make with respect to the age. But just another point that came up in terms of the study.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but one of the things that I want you all to start to think a little bit more about, and you're already sort of doing this in your zoning ordinance, but thinking about matching property types to the right size lot and where they are, so that you can sort of ease a little bit of the concerns when saying like, hey, we're not going to let any property just go to, duplexes or 4 units or, something else. It's only going to be certain properties that meet these minimum requirements. That helps to sort of ease the anxiety, and quite frankly, allows you to sort of step yourself into it a little bit more rather than sort of jumping in head first. Yeah.
For these types of projects, do you find that they are renovations or new construction?
Yeah, so some of them are renovations, but you can get new construction in this. And I think the nice thing about where Fairfield is at, and this is a little bit of this sort of double-edged sword, is the market is there in Fairfield to justify this. When you get into weaker housing markets, what you're going to rent 1,000 square feet for doesn't justify the development cost, but in Fairfield it will. The way that I like to talk about a lot of this is what you're trying to do with this kind of housing is it's not going to get at the really low income residents. That's not going to be provided through like this market. What you're doing is you're diversifying your housing stock so you can attract people can find sort of what they need a little bit easier, but you're also going to hit what I like to call sort of like absolute affordable housing issues. At a certain point, you're never going to get New York City rents at 1,000 square feet, right? There's a max that somebody's going to be willing to pay in Fairfield at 1,000 square feet. And what that means is that some people can make a housing compromise. They can say to themselves, listen, me and my girlfriend, we could go out and be out in the suburbs, right? And we could get a nice big home, but we're gonna pay about the same, but we're gonna have a smaller unit here, and for that, it makes it affordable. So it's not a square foot, you know, by square foot equivalent, but they're getting they're making the right trade-off. And I think that's gonna be really important in making advances in sort of addressing the equity concerns that a lot of people are bringing up, and the question about diversity and inclusion that has been sort of raised in a lot of the engagement efforts. Yeah.
Thank you. Because one of the things when I'm thinking about making these changes in these areas where I would think most of the lots, if not all the lots, have existing structures on there, is we make the change, does anything happen? Is the market enough to entice the developer to go buy a small single family to either renovate, knock down and do this?
And I think that what you want to do, or my recommendation would be, is to start, try it, see what happens, see how quickly it's change, and be ready to adjust and move quickly on it. Because you're gonna find out relatively quickly what's gonna happen when one project is successful and somebody's like, hey, this is working, and somebody else comes in and says, hey, it's successful. You're going to find out, or you may just go 5 or 6 years and nothing happens. Right. You're going to have to say, shoot, what are we doing wrong here? We got to figure out a different solution. But I will say that this is sort of the state of the art in where the missing middle is happening across the country. There's a lot of communities that are basically saying, we need to start building more stuff like this. We need to start exploring this in a little bit more detail. This is where we need to start. And I think my guess is that it's going to be a little bit like we had the conversation about mixed use previously. It's going to take the development community a little bit of time to catch up and realize that there's demand for this kind of stuff. But as the demand starts to pick up, you're going to start to get developers who specialize in this kind of housing. And more, if you go out and you talk to the development communities, there are developers who only build one product. They've got their product, they go out and they find the right places for it, and they build it. And you're gonna start to see that in this. Basically, what I would say is everything from about 3 units all the way up to about 20 units. That's increasingly across the country. Town after town that I work in, all the planning committee or conventions that I go to, all the towns are looking for that size housing. And when there's that level of demand, developers are going to start to take notice on it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Adam, do you see that this kind of housing is possible for sale or just for rent?
I think a lot of it is going to be condos. I think it's going to be something that's going to be for sale. I think it's going to, you might get some for rent stuff. Typically what I see with housing like this is if it's a conversion of an old single family home into multiple units, then it's rental, and it's the homeowner who did it. They're using it as an income generating property. But a developer who's going to build this is not likely going to want to take on the responsibility of maintaining a rental relationship for years. They're going to be looking to sell this out. And, you know, they sell. People are, you know, say, hey, I'm going to live with essentially 4 other people, right? It's not all that different than living in a townhome, and they move on these projects.
I would agree. Our experience in the 2-family product that we have more of, it's of recent vintage, tends to be a for sale product rather than a rental product.
And just to be, you know, over time, the other thing that you could also see with these, especially these 4 families, is somebody buys one of the units and rents the unit below it. And so you get a sort of like live rent kind of environment so, I mean, not to get too anecdotal, but I live on a block, I live in a row home, the 2 people to the left of me and the 2 people to the right of me, it's all the same family. They just bought on the block as, you know, units came online. It makes something like that very, very possible with like a 4 unit development, but that's usually 10, 15, 20 years down the line on these.
just another comment on that, that if it's for sale in a town like Fairfield, I don't see it's gonna be affordable in any capacity, because it's gonna exceed the affordability limits.
Yeah, and I want to be really clear here about when we're talking about affordable. I am not talking about affordable with a capital A, affordable. What we're really talking about is, maybe a better word to use would be accessible to a demographic that's already having a really hard time finding a home in Fairfield. I mean, the towns that are going to struggle, personal opinion, towns that are going to struggle over the long term is the housing market, as far as I can tell, has no slowing down for another decade. We have not built enough housing for all the people who want it in this country. And so the issue is going to be maintaining residents, getting people to move in. What you want are products that, for example, a young couple can buy so that they can establish themselves in Fairfield. Once they have a kid, they stay in the place until the kid needs to go to school or gets big enough that they can't handle being in the same unit with them, you know, the whole time. And they go out and they buy a bigger house, but they've moved up the economic ladder. The other thing that these are, you know, are really great products for are, you know, quite honestly, like you get divorced, you want to stay in town, you move into something like this. Your kids move out of your house, you're looking for a smaller option, you don't want to rent, you want a higher quality, you can move into it. But because of the size of the unit, you're maxing out on the absolute number when it comes to how much you're paying. On a square footage basis, it's pretty expensive, but on an absolute basis, it's not nearly as expensive. All right, so let's keep going. So regulating character and form. This is going to be a really important piece of all of this, because a lot of what we're talking about up into this point is sort of the uses, the number of units, the sort of layout. But one of the things that we heard over and over again is this concern that the character of the community is changing. I think you called them prison buildings in your way. I would hope that, you know, we could put together some regulation and character and form standards that it's not going to impact the 8-30G projects, but it's going to impact a lot of the other ones, and it'll help to set up standard around character and form. So if we go forward to this. So form-based code is a really great way to go about doing this. To be clear about when we're talking about sort of form-based code, we're not talking about dictating a style. We're not saying, oh, all the buildings have to be a Queen Anne style, or oh, they all have to be, you know, a Victorian style. What you're talking about is some standard proportions, some key elements. So this is from another project that I worked on that I was referencing earlier in Pennsylvania. One of the things that they found in their community, they did a big sort of public engagement process. And what they said was, you know what, porches are just the backbone of our community. They're where people spend their time. It's how we interact with our neighbors. If you don't have a porch on your building, you are not part of it. It was media. You are not in media. So what we said is, okay, you've got to have a porch, but then we also, and it's not shown here, we set some standards to what those porches had to be, because what a lot of people were doing were they were building what I'd call it sort of faux porches. You know, they were 1.5 feet deep. They looked like a porch, but you couldn't even put a chair on them. So putting some standards around what those would look like. So one of the things that I really like is the building on the top up there and the building on the bottom there. Those are both multifamily projects. The one on the top, I think, is 5 or 6 units. The one on the bottom is a rehab of a 4. The one on the top is actually new construction. But because of the form of the building and the way that it relates to its surroundings, it was big, but it felt like media to a lot of people. And it felt like a place that was like home within the community, even though it was larger than a lot of the single family homes that they saw in their community. So if we go forward, as you continue to sort of dip your toe into this, and this is a little bit hard to see, you can start to talk about form when it comes to larger unit buildings. So one of the things that, and we can even zoom in a little bit more if you want to. There are all different types of forms out there that you could go to that get with more or less units. But there are courtyard buildings, there's sort of what are called cottage courtyard buildings, multiplex kind of buildings. There's a lot of historical precedents for these. But these are multifamily buildings that are not what you would typically think of as like an apartment building. There was a lot of this built in this country for a while, and then it really fell out of favor. It's really coming back into favor, and I expect over the next 10 years to see more and more developers who are sort of specializing in this size of housing because there's a lot of communities that are interested. We're not saying go out and go permit 12 and 6 and 7 unit buildings in all of your zones right now. What I'm saying is, as you go forward and you continue to explore these 4 unit sort of changes, maybe some of these changes to the B properties that we talked about earlier, starting to think about some of these other size buildings and what they might look like within the context of your community. So I won't get into a lot of detail on this, but I just want to say we are aware of the Metro Center TOD recommendations. We think implementing them is an important part of your housing strategy. It's yet another different housing typology that I think creates some opportunities for a variety of housing in Fairfield. If we go to the next slide. You've got this TOD plan. There's some, really great recommendations here. But we also know that there's some things that aren't working in your current zoning that's not allowing that to move forward. And so if you go to the next slide, one of the things that needs to be sort of thought about here is potentially simplifying some of the regulations. If you were to create a new zone here that was really focused on TOD, you could call it the Metro Center TOD zone. It would do a good job of marketing that area as what you want it to be. Believe it or not, your zoning code is marketing what you want, what you call your zones, impacts what people think about what they should be building there. And there are developers who are basically out there going community by community, looking at regulations and trying to determine whether it's even worth thinking about doing a project there. Some consolidated design standards I think could be very helpful here. There's a need to sort of coordinate the public improvements like open space that are here. One of the problems with the regulations right now is you're essentially requiring a developer lot by lot to provide open space, but that just becomes very problematic when you're trying to do a cohesive development strategy across a larger geography like that. The same thing is this 20% commercial requirement. So you're requiring every lot there to be 20% commercial, but that just doesn't make sense in a lot of ways. What you want to do is allow for some flexibility so that across the entire zone, you're meeting that 20% commercial minimum without requiring every single property owner to include it, which is going to be a real burden for a lot of the property owners through here. So with that, I'll just really quickly, there's some opportunities here to actually downzone some areas in support of the resiliency conversation that we had previously. This is mostly, this is in that Rooster River floodway area, which would really be downzoning this area to A, which would reduce incentives to develop in the hazard area. It would create some non-conforming uses here, but it would be really consistent with the resiliency framework that we talked about in our previous conversation. So with that, I will take a deep breath and open it up to questions and discussion. Yeah, please.
Sorry, your deep breath was. I think in the earlier part of your presentation, you talked about sustainability, and it sounds like feedback from the workshop is that's something people are committed to. That's what they want to see in our development.
Yep.
I guess, are there any principles when it comes to zoning where we can create a more sustainable community? Are there design standards? Are there, there's always this conversation that perhaps, more dense housing is actually better. I don't know, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, especially in the era of climate change. We're a coastal community, so that's something I would love to hear more about.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big challenges, and I think I'm very happy to have our sub-consultant on here, Resilient Land and Water, who gave the last presentation. A big challenge for you all is going to be the resiliency question. Long-term climate change is going to have a real impact on your community, and thinking long-term like you are now is going to be really important. I do think there are some sustainability, so to make the difference here, resiliency is typically a conversation about, how to protect areas and ensure that long-term as a result of climate change, that your community can continue to function and serve the social and economic needs of its residents. The sustainability is a little bit more about sort of trying to prevent some of that from happening or mitigate some of that, but also making sure that whatever you do have continues to provide year over year, decade over decade to the different residents and stakeholders there. So I do think as a general principle, density is a framework that needs to be used in order to understand sustainability, because denser development requires less resources to support it. I think you have a framework for that. I think your TOD plan does a really great job of establishing a framework that is going to support more transit use, which is, more sustainable, which is going to support more walkable community, which is more sustainable. Every person who decides, hey, I'm going to walk where I was going to, I'm going to ride my bike where I was going to, instead of driving, is sort of doing a little bit in that respect. One of the things that we haven't gotten into in a lot of detail here, but a lot of the work that you've been doing on your pedestrian and bicycle network is a really important part of that sustainability work. We can talk to and look at a little bit of some of the green building design technologies and sort of encouraging for that. To be perfectly honest with you, that's going to be hard to integrate into your standards from a regulatory perspective, because you're not the type of community that's got huge tracts of green open space that's going to get redeveloped, where you're really going to need to focus on some of those things. And you also don't have major office parks where you could install lots of solar panels, or you could do geothermal. You're in a community that's more piece by piece, and as I understand it, you don't have any regulations that are prohibiting people from doing a lot of that work. So yeah, we can look into that. Yeah.
So if there is work to be done in terms of introducing form-based code, is there opportunities there to kind of make sustainable measures part of that, as part of the form-based code, maybe more sustainable building materials, things like that?
Yeah, I think it is, where you get a little bit of, you need to be a little bit careful around zoning ordinances is when you start to creep into building code standards, then the lawyers get a little, they start to perspire a little bit. It gets a little bit dangerous. But a big thing that you want to make sure that you're doing is you're not setting any standards out there that's going to make it more difficult for people to do the right thing. And then the next thing is that a lot of things that, or what a lot of communities will do is they'll do things like checklists. They'll do things like just design guidance. And what I like to say is the checklist is something that every development application has to fill out. And it's not a requirement that you have to do it, but you have to go and say, answer a question. How are you addressing this thing? And what it does is it brings the conversation to the forefront of the applicant. And when an applicant wants to sort of curry a little bit of favor with your officials, they may be including some of that stuff knowing that's important to you. The nice thing about design recommendations, essentially, these are not design standards, so these are not things that people have to do, but they sort of establish a baseline of what the community would like to see. And so when you go through the variance application process and you go into negotiations with a developer and they say, well, we'd like to do this, and you're like, well, we've got these design standards that we'd really like you to meet a couple of. Why don't you go back and look at those and come back to us on those? Those are separate than what I would say are like design requirements. And I think there are some opportunities to include real like standards and things that developers have to meet in order to get an application approved. And some of those things are going to be things like on your ground floor retail spaces, setting a minimum requirement of like transparency for the windows so that nobody can build something that's just like a flat blank wall. And when the impact that has is it means that streets are more enjoyable, people want to walk along them, and that sort of contributes long-term to the sustainability of the community. Does that answer your question?
I have a two-part question. I worry a little bit that we're adding a whole lot of density in the areas that are going to be most inundated to coastal flooding over the next 27 years. I've heard by the year 2050, which I think is 27 years from now, we will have a 20-inch rise in sea level. And I don't know how far in it will go, but so the whole Post Road area is subject to that, as well as the Rooster River area. Those areas seem to be where we're going to, if this gets implemented, we would be going, modifying the regs to allow all this high density. And then sort of part of that is not just the density of people, but the increase in impervious surfaces. I believe strongly we need more trees. Trees provide shade. I've read some studies where the temperature on a street can be like 30 or 40, 50 degrees lower in the summer when you have shade trees. And if you allow them building out on a smaller lot, you can't fit a house on a smaller lot and still maintain any green space, it looks like. So I worry a little bit about having the lot smaller and building them out completely and having pretty much no green space and not enough trees. That's one concern I have.
Yeah, I think those are all really valid concerns. So really quickly, to be clear, along the Rooster River, we're actually talking about down zoning, so encouraging less development along the Rooster River.
Well, along the river, but the whole area is not right along the river. So there's other parts that are, I think, would fall into the category of upzoning and adding the ability to have these, larger middle housing, which I would just worry about not having enough green space, not preserving enough.
Yeah, I just, the one thing to keep in mind on that, and I don't disagree with you overall, but the areas that we were talking about in the presentation are not areas that are in the floodplain. The ones that are, we agree, right around Rooster River. The ones we're talking about increasing density are not in flood zones primarily. And we're talking about a very limited total acreage, if you will, of those sites. What we're trying to do overall is to create a menu of options. One of the things, and I think Steve handed out an outline of some of the recommendations that came out of the Affordable Housing Plan, and included in that, while we didn't really touch on it much tonight, we have talked about it in the past in the conjunction with our work in whether or not to include that as a recommendation in the Affordable Housing Plan, is also consider bumping up the density in our present design residential district opportunity to where the densities used to be. Basically, it's the condo, it's the overlay zone that allowed condominiums to develop. In the late 80s, there was a lot of pushback, and the marketplace was really hot. People wanted to do condos, and it was like, whoa, we need to slow this down, and the densities were drastically reduced. And as a consequence, there hasn't been any kind of development of that type. So one of the recommendations that came out of the Affordable Housing Plan was to consider that density too. But going back to some of Adam's original comments, if you look at the map, the town as a whole, we're talking about a very small subset of the whole where these types of strategies would ultimately be implemented. So it's not a completely town-wide implementation, but targeted in much smaller geographies where it does create opportunities for different housing types, and more importantly, especially as it relates to considering expanding the center design district opportunity is to provide an option that's more than you can do today, but perhaps less than what you would do if you just want a full-blown affordable housing application, to try to create another opportunity to capture investment opportunity in the way we kind of see it happen versus, you know what, I can't do enough under your zoning scheme, I'm going to go 8-30G because then I don't have to pay attention to your regulations. So we're trying to cover a lot of bases here and try to diversify some of the housing types that we have, and also try to give development opportunity a chance to do something that we may be more comfortable with than dare I say, the nuclear option, you know.
I don't know if, Jim, you want to kind of reference that it's really just this river corridor here.
Right.
That we're talking about for the most part.
And I just want to make it really clear that we are approaching this really intentionally. So the first presentation that we came to you all with, and we can send this sort of back out here, was the resiliency conversation. We really want to start with the environment, where things we saw were really going to change, where are the areas that you need to sort of like protect long-term, where are some places that you're going to need to really think critically about what are going to be the environmental impacts and what impacts are they going to have on your community. One of the things that's really critical and that we heard loud and clear in that conversation with is resiliency is about the intersection of a changing environment with the built environment that we've got right now, the places that we care about, the history that we all know there. And so, you know, there are going to be strategies where you say, you know what, this area is so important to us. This area has such a key symbolic and cultural, you know, element to us that we're going to need to invest in protecting those areas. And I think that's going to be dealing in where we're talking about the zoning, more of the localized flooding area issues, not so much like, you know, sea level rise type issues, but a changing climate's going to impact that. And so one of the things that we certainly can look at, and I've got kind of underlined here, is sort of looking at like impervious surface requirements and trees, and what is the sort of climate that's going to be created through some of this new development. That's certainly something we can look at.
I have another short question. Yeah. When you say form-based, does that mean the zoning commission does not approve applications?
No, so all that means is that I like to talk about it this way. It brings a third dimension to your zoning ordinance. It doesn't change any of the policies or procedures about how an application is reviewed. And so if we can, Emmeline, can we just like switch over to that slide? Actually, why don't we go one more? It'll just be a little bit easier to talk about. Yeah. So under a traditional sort of what's called Euclidean zoning, which unfortunately is not based on Euclid, you know, but is in fact is based on Euclid the city, you would say you are permitted a 7-unit building, up to 7 units residential building. That would be sort of the end of it. And you might set some side yard setbacks and some rear yard setbacks, but you basically leave it to the developer to figure out what they were going to build. In a form-based approach, what you're saying is basically, in this instance, you're permitted a courtyard building with 7 units. And you put some real definition to what that meant. You would specify the amount of open space, where parking was, the form of the building, and that would be sort of core to the definition of what's permitted, so that if somebody came in there and says, well, like, I want to do a 7-unit building, but it's going to be in some wacky, weird form that doesn't work, that's not permitted. And so where form-based zoning has come into favor is in places where there's a need to be sort of, or understand the predictability of the development, where people want to say, hey, we've got an established community character here. It's really important what the building looks like from the street, how it relates to its neighbors. then we can control some of those things. The key thing that is, I think, important here is it's not typically a style design guide. It's not saying, hey, you have to, build a Cape Cod style. It still allows for modern architecture if you want. It still allows for, all different sort of style expressions. It's just more about the form that the different buildings take. Yeah.
And first of all, thank you, great presentation, but a question, these are recommendations for changes in the POCD, these are not changes in the regulations, is that correct?
So the POCD should be the foundation for zoning changes. So what we would start with is these as suggestions in the POCD that these changes happen in the zoning ordinance. Then you would go through the process of updating your zoning ordinance. And that's part of our contract, is to do what in our contract are called substantial changes to the zoning ordinance. So we have a task that we're working on right now, which is basically it's a little bit more than house cleaning for you guys. It's a pretty substantial reorganization of your zoning ordinance so that it's actually easy to use, that people can understand what you're trying to regulate. So we're actually working on that right now. Then there'd be a second round of revisions, which would take some of the recommendations that we're talking about right now and translate them into actual changes in the zoning ordinance.
And all of those changes would have to go to public hearing?
Absolutely.
Oh, no, I get to just adopt them myself. It's just me, I write them, and yes, it goes to public hearings, and, we're going to want your feedback on all of this. I think the biggest thing from a sort of philosophical perspective on this is, if we are writing any sort of zoning ordinance, or we're making these recommendations, it's really in my office on a computer, there's just so many opportunities for errors. There's so many opportunities for me to miss something. I'm very good at what I do, I like to think, but I can still miss things. And I'm looking for feedback along the way this whole time. So when we were to go through a zoning change, there'd be public hearings on this, and then ultimately it'd have to be adopted. So that would have to go through that public process as well.
There's a lot of steps along the way yet to come. What we're trying to work towards is seeing what the comfort level is in the purpose of this discussion is basically, are there any recommendations or concepts that we've been talking about that you would not want us to consider exploring further? This is not the end of the discussion. We're trying to get feedback on what we might advance forward for more discussion. So when we ultimately come to a draft document, it's inclusive of all the conversations that we've had, and obviously that has to go out to a broad public hearing process and discussion until we get to a document. And then once that occurs and we ultimately get to an adopted document, the next step is, okay, which of the implementation steps are we going to take, to try to achieve some of the goals that we've established in the plan.
We'll go there and then.
So I think early in the presentation, there's 4 pictures of essentially the same zoning, but how they could play out differently. And I think how buildings end up looking make a big difference in how a type of zoning is received. So I think that makes it important. Something like implementing a form-based code is really important, because if that's not done, it could create a really bad reaction. It could be very poorly received. So I wonder, just from a sequencing perspective, how that would play out if we're to implement the form-based code and then also change some of the zoning.
Yeah, I can't answer that definitively. So I think you're right in saying that the reception of early projects is going to make a big difference to be, because if you do the zoning, right, nothing changes. Like everybody wakes up the next day and everything, you know, the environment is exactly the way you left it. But there are going to be some early projects in those. And, you know, we've certainly seen in our experience that the quality of those early projects and how well they sort of come out makes a big difference, and sort of as you build along there. And if they look right and people are happy with them, it sort of builds momentum. And if there's struggle, there's always going to be the X factor of the developer, right? They're always going to be, you know, sometimes you look out and you get somebody who's really good and knows what they're doing and really is there to work. Sometimes, you know, that's why we have zoning ordinances. I think the really important thing about like a form-based code is it is not something, there are like, if you go out, you're going to go home and you're going to Google form-based zoning. Be careful what you read on the internet. It's a little bit like Googling WebMD, and like you've all of a sudden like, I don't know, my girlfriend does this. She's like, I'm dying. And it's like, no, you just have a cold, right? You know, there's a lot of information out there about form-based codes. There's a Form-Based Code Institute. There's all of this. It doesn't have to happen all at once. You can sort of apply elements of a form-based code to just one zone. Just one part of your code can start to incorporate it. And a lot of what's happened in really in the past like 5 to 7 years with these is they sort of started in this greenfield development space, and everybody started to realize like, oh my God, this is a really valuable tool. And they started bringing it into all different types of regulation. And so what you can see a lot more are what called like hybrid form-based codes. And that's really what I would likely recommend for Fairfield is you're bringing pieces of the form-based sort of approach to it. And really which is talking about the vertical quality of a building and how it relates to the street, bringing that in the code without bringing in a very complicated, sometimes overly complicated zoning sort of structure and format. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so essentially you could, rather than making it so complicated at the beginning that it just delays the rezoning, you could sort of just introduce some guardrails initially, so.
Yeah, I think I would use the term design guidelines, maybe more so than a strict form-based code, because you know, as Kathy alluded to, if you go to a strict, full-blown form-based code, it is typically, hey, if it looks like this, you're approved, and we don't have to go through a public process. That's not what we're looking at here. We're just kind of looking at a hybrid approach to bring a more definitive, in certain discrete geographies, downtown in particular, is there an opportunity to create some more definitive design guidelines that are form-based, but don't end up, you know, don't result in a full-blown traditional form-based code.
I could not have said it better, Mike. So we were over here and then.
I think these ideas you presented are really great, and I just wanted to say that. But toward the goals of resiliency and also toward finding more affordable housing, both capital A and small A affordable housing. Are there other areas that you would suggest we pursue that you've seen work? For example, we talked, you know, just thinking out of the box, about the possibility of reclaiming parking lot areas that are excessive. We talked about the possibility of recapturing town-owned land or repurposing town-owned land. Perhaps we could reconfigure town-owned land in some way. But are there other things like this that seem to have worked that we could consider or should consider in our study?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. If I had a definitive answer for you, you'd never see me again because I'd be in the Bahamas somewhere or, you know, on vacation because I'd have sold that idea for, you know, millions of dollars. Some things that I would think about as you approach this. Affordable housing is an issue that I care a lot about, I think a lot about. I think that it is, in a lot of ways, an incredibly complex problem that is very fundamentally rooted in the land structure that we have in our country, the way that we develop housing, our tax code. It's a really difficult problem that's going to be, and I think it's really important when you start out on some of these issues, things that are very difficult to address at a local level. You've got a big hill to climb. And I just want to emphasize that because I think when you start to tackle those kinds of big problems, and I know you all are working on this a lot, not to get discouraged that, hey, we seem to be sort of knocking away at this. One thing that it seems interesting to me, given all that caveats, one thing that it seems sort of interesting to me and something to think about are non-regulatory ways of going about promoting affordable housing. And thinking about affordable housing not just from a production side of things, but also from an existing user side of things. So one of the things that we know about affordable housing, that one of the big obstacles for people to access, for example, for purchase of housing, is it's not the monthly payment that's the obstacle. It's the down payment that's the obstacle. They're paying as much as they would in rent as they would in a mortgage payment. But I mean, it is crazy to think about, you know, from my perspective, a person amassing $150,000 as a down payment on a house. It's a huge obstacle to get to if you don't have basically inherited wealth. And that's a big obstacle, especially for people who have student loan debt or credit card debt. So one of the strategies that people are looking at is quite honestly like down payment assistance stuff. But that's not something that you're going to be able to regulate, but it is something that you could, you know, there are a lot of like foundations that are working with it, nonprofits that are working in that space. And it's really about partnership agreements at that point. You really got to work with a lot of different entities to try to sort of build that. Another thing about it is just working on the sort of marketing side, making sure that you can help people access the affordable housing options that you do have. That's a big part. So you said that, you know, veterans issues are a big issue to you, senior issues, making sure that they have a pipeline into the affordable housing options that they've got can make as much of a difference than like a production side of the affordable housing that you can. And then this is less of an issue in Fairfield, where you basically already have a massive affordable housing problem to get. But in a lot of communities, what they're looking at is essentially, how do you allow people to stay in their homes and repair and improve their homes so that they're staying in that space and they're not having to go out and get there. I know you have an ADU ordinance, and I know that that's one of the ways that people are looking at it, but a lot of communities are looking at sort of more like direct assistance help to people. I do think that it can get very, like the idea of like we need to build more affordable housing, that like can get a little bit of a target fixation around it. So thinking about some of those options. And you know, you are in this place where the 830G applications really are going to be, it seems like, a continuing reality for you. And so, you know, to the extent that you can get out there and, you know, educate people about the importance of affordable housing, which I know you all are doing, you know, promoting that message, I think that can help. And helping people really understand the distinction between 830G affordable housing and market rate affordable housing and some of the other options, so that you don't have this conflation a little bit of like what we're talking about, where it's like, you've got this like, it's a thorn in your side, right? It's like coming in and it's a good thing, but it's a bad thing, and it's a prison, you know, it's a, you know, some ways, but like I care about affordable housing, and that you can separate that out at least a little bit from the issues. But I just keep coming back to it is a national crisis. It's something that communities across the country are really struggling with. So keep working, but also don't get discouraged that you're not going to be able to fix everything on this, because it's a really, really difficult problem.
Just to kind of tie things up here a little bit, we are going to distribute the presentation that was made tonight. what our goal is out of this is there anything, any of these ideas that we've talked about tonight, are any of them, should they be off the table for future broader discussion? What we're looking for is to advance some ideas going forward that might end up in the plan for further consideration, but we need to know if, are we in the right ballpark with what we're talking here, or any of these ideas should be, you know, not even considered? I mean, I don't expect you to answer that the second sitting here, but we will get you the presentation, and then in the next coming weeks, after you've had a chance to reflect on that, if you've got questions or concerns or something that, hey, I really don't think we need to do that, or yeah, we're okay, you know, with the basic strategies that we're putting forth here. That's really kind of the feedback we're after.
Can I just echo, and on top of that, if you have any other, hey, look at the B zone, there's some options there, you know, I've been talking with Mark about some of this, continue to feed that to us as well.
I thought the concepts were really creative. I liked them. Please speak goodbye, Mike.
Can you move the mic to the thing?
But, be careful of parking.
Yep.
Because we have a lot of very small acreage. So they're already on the street. Some of them have no garages, some of them have no driveways. Mm-hmm. And you have to be careful when you turn them from ones to twos or threes or even fours. Though they look very attractive and they probably fit in, you just have to be careful of all these cars.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good point, and we did opt out of the state mandated maximum parking standards, so we have flexibility to create it. The issue sometimes becomes, you know, you can have driveway that provides 6 parking spaces for them, but yet some folks find it easier to park out in the street in front of their house. So I mean, I agree with you completely. The parking calculus has to be an important part of the consideration.
There you go.
Thank you, and yeah, I'd like to echo Herb's comments that your presentation was excellent. I learned a lot. I could listen to you forever. You're very good. Thank you. I just want to ask, and I'm sure you're not a stranger to the legislator in Connecticut, and you know, zoning is a hot issue. I know that's the trend across the country.
Yeah.
And we've seen a lot of initiatives, bills in the last few years. Some, in fact, would probably call for towns like Fairfield to create thousands of units. And, you know, and I don't know if we have the infrastructure, the ability to do that, but how do you take account into the changing, I guess, regulatory and law landscape that's happening here in Connecticut?
I'll take a stab at that. You're right, and that conversation is not going away. There's likely going to be another slew of bills in this upcoming session. I know that there are other, there's a lot of feedback for bills that didn't go forward that may get repackaged, understanding what the flaws in those underlying bills were. So there are going to be other forces outside of this discussion that may change the regulatory landscape. But I think we need to be mindful of that, and what we're looking for is opportunities of where are you comfortable looking for more density here, because that conversation is not going to go away. We do need to provide opportunities for more density, and I think if we don't, if communities continue not to produce units, then that increases the likelihood that those will be imposed upon us rather than having locally grown strategies. So we're trying to, you know, provide as much opportunity to provide an increase in the number of units in a manner that we think we can live with, and that's the best we can do. And if there's a higher, you know, if the state changes the rules of the game, we'll need to adjust and see how we can, you know, deal with that makes sense for us.
Yeah, the only thing I will say is, you know, Jim, maybe just because you've been knocking away at this, I hope that a lot of what we're recommending is more than just what you can live with too. I mean, I will say that a lot of what is here, I think, in the recommendations has, to the sustainability question, to the resiliency question, going to make, positive contributions to Fairfield. And that's going all the way back to the beginning of this conversation. I know that there's a lot of conversation about affordable housing. There is a group of people who are going to be against all affordable housing and are on that. I think there's a big middle ground here. And I think there is, what we heard over and over again was a desire to create a space for a diversity of people to live in, to maintain a lot of the character and quality that people care about in this community. So I think there's some space there, and a lot of what we're doing is, going to make the community a better place as part of that. And I'm just pulling your leg a little bit.
I appreciate you re-articulating that.
I have a follow-up. Do you do follow-up statistics of some of these development programs you've implemented in other cities or other communities? I have a question about property values. When you sort of upzone, which some people might consider downgrading, to allow fourplexes where there were single-family zones, is there an issue with property values going down of the single-family zones, single-family homes?
Yeah, so to be clear here, when we're talking about that 4-family unit, it's already permitted. What we're really doing is talking about sort of making the lot size that it's permitted on slightly smaller. It's about a 20% decrease in the lot size to essentially increase the number of lots that are eligible for that kind of housing. Does that make sense?
Oh, I thought you were changing zones to allow more, changing certain zones that might not allow it, to allow it, or you're not doing?
No, you're right. We are talking about switching a couple of zones into that zone as well.
So is that an issue with existing single-family homes losing value? Is there any follow-up statistics on, that you are aware of that you could give us later, maybe not right now?
Yeah, I mean, I can look at it. My experience has typically been that those kinds of things don't have a big impact. A lot of property value is tied much more to what are the schools like, what can you access, what jobs are nearby. That's what drives a lot of the property values. Quite honestly, if anything, it increases property values because it increases the opportunity of what could be built on some places. And so, if you have a 10,000 square foot lot right now, you can't build 4 units on it. So if you can now build 4 units on it, that lot is more valuable than it otherwise would be. So, but it's really on the fringes of things that you're going to see any substantial changes in property values. Just because if you think about when you're going around looking for a house and when you're trying to buy a house, your checklist of things that you're going through does not start with, is there a 4-family house nearby or not? In a lot of ways, it's about where is it located? What are the schools like for a lot of people? How close is it to my job? What are the things I can access by it? How nice is the house? How nice are the amenities that are? And then maybe you're thinking about sort of the character of the neighborhood around it.
We should probably wrap it at this point, but again, we're going to distribute this out. These are the concepts that we have kind of been talking about, want to share them out with you folks before we go to a broader audience. So, like I said, in the coming weeks, any additional feedback you have from this is going to be very important to us. So thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, Adam. It's been, Adam and his team from where we sit, are a lot of fun to work with, and it's been great, and we're glad we had this opportunity to have the conversation tonight.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all very much.
With that, I think we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Thank you to our staff. Barnhart, thank you for showing up as well, and Adam, thank you to you and your team. Thank you.